Questions orales, oral questions. L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. After 8 long years of this Prime Minister, he's not worth the cost, and especially in Quebec, where the inflation rate has hit 4.8%, higher than elsewhere in Canada. After 8 years of inflationary deficits, the solution proposed by the Liberals and the Bloc is to significantly increase costs through a tax on gas and diesel that will increase the cost of every product that's transported. Will they put an end to these inflationary policies so that Quebecers can buy food and gas and housing? The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous n'avons aucune leçon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have no lessons to take from the Conservatives. What the Conservatives are proposing for the Canadians listening to us is to cut services, cut investments, and cut the future of Canada. We have a plan to help Canadians prosper in the 21st century economy. And what Canadians are realizing is that the Conservatives are too dangerous for our country. Thank you.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I will ignore that member's lack of decorum and his emotionally charged approach to focus on Canadians. Because I can actually take it. I can take the debate and have it out in the open. But Mr. Speaker, he talks about cuts. Canadians are making cuts in their own lives. We now have a new phenomenon in Canada, which is the middle class homeless. We used to just have young people living in their parents' basements. Now we have parents moving into their children's basements. Will the Prime Minister reverse the inflationary policies that doubled housing costs and are forcing seniors to move into their kids' basements just to avoid going homeless?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable colleague for the question. Canada has a AAA credit rating, the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7, and low unemployment. And in addition, we will always be there to support the middle class, Mr. Speaker, whether it is 6 million old age seniors with the old age security benefit, whether it is 11 million Canadians with the grocery rebate, whether it is 4 million Canadians with the business supports. Mr. Speaker, what we do on this side of the House is invest in Canadians to build a stronger economy day after day, year after year, and we will continue on that course. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Incompetent rating agencies mean absolutely nothing to the, quote, unhoused seniors who say that for affordable housing in Metro Vancouver, that the only thing that turns up is nothing, nothing, and nothing. Nor does it mean anything to, and I quote again, this is even from the CBC, living in his broken down car, homeless man says he has until Thursday to move. We have both nurses and carpenters living in parking lots after 8 years of this Prime Minister doubling housing costs. Will they stop driving up the cost of living so that Canadians can house, feed, and heat their families?
The Honourable Minister.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and here's the truth for seniors. Fixing the global inflation problem is not going to be fixed by cutting dental support to 3.5 million seniors, and that's what the Leader of the Opposition would do. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, to get to the tens of billions of dollars of cuts he's talking about, it would mean cuts to our healthcare system. It would mean making sure, unfortunately, that the investments like we saw in BC to transform our health system won't happen. What does that mean, Mr. Speaker? It doesn't mean just poor health outcomes. It means more costs in the future. It means a less resilient country, and it means a much worse future for our seniors. That's what he's peddling, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Actually, this government that's promising over $10 billion of cuts right now because they suddenly woke up and realized that they were bankrupt. When we were in office, we actually managed to balance the budget while growing healthcare spending every single year. In fact, growing it faster than the current government. But today, the biggest threat to the health of Canadians is homelessness. People are losing their homes because this Prime Minister has doubled the cost of housing. Will he realize, with people living in parking lots, that after 8 years, he's just not worth the cost?
Mr. Speaker, unlike the party opposite
L'honorable ministre.
side of the House, we don't balance budgets on the backs of Canadians. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we invest in Canadians. Let me give you one example, Mr. Speaker. Lifting almost 500,000 children out of poverty with the Canada Child Benefit. And every single time there's an opportunity to support Canadians, Mr. Speaker, what does the other side of the House do? They vote against. Contre. That is not the way in which we will build a strong economy.
Once again, I'd like to remind members to please conduct themselves in a way that is appropriate. And I'll also ask members to please keep the voices down so the speaker can hear at least what is going on. If not, the members would ask a question. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the member is right about one thing. They don't balance the budget on the backs of Canadians. They run massive inflationary deficits on the backs of Canadians. On another matter, Mr. Speaker, our hearts were broken to see a hospital in Gaza struck by a missile. Disinformation peddled by Hamas and regurgitated by CBC was then amplified by the Prime Minister. Does he agree with President Biden that the offending missile originated with terrorists in Gaza?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, our government has been unequivocal in condemning the terrorist attacks of Hamas against Israeli citizens. We are also adamant that attacks on civilians are wrong. We call on all parties to observe international law. Our hearts go out to the innocent Palestinian victims that have died as a result of this attack, and we will continue to work with partners around the world to call for a humanitarian corridor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Belleuil.
The Honourable Leader of Belleuil-Chambre.
Dans le terrible conflit qui déchire la bande de Gaza.
The conflict tearing Gaza apart means that civilians are leaving in unspeakable distress. Humanitarian aid needs to get to the Gaza Strip. It needs to be able to get there without condition, regardless of the origin of those conditions. Canada needs a strong voice to do anything in this context. They need to reach out to friends in Israel or Palestine and friends of peace. Will Canada join the initiative with the United States, Germany, France, the UK, and others?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président, et j'aimerais remercier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for the question. The Minister of Foreign Affairs was one of the first to go to that region in order to be there for our Israeli and Palestinian friends. We were one of the first nations to give a strong voice to the situation between Israel and Hamas. And we are there to continue to have a humanitarian corridor, and we are there to defend the rights of all civilians in that zone.
L'honorable député.
The Honourable Leader or Member for Belleuil-Chambly. The United Nations cannot be heard alone. They need friends and credibility. Am I given to understand that the Prime Minister over the last 11 days has not spoken once to the President of the United States? In the countries neighboring Quebec, they say you have to walk the talk, or les bottines doivent suivre les babines. We need to go beyond good intentions. Should the Prime Minister not consider walking the talk? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the beginning of this truly horrendous crisis for everyone involved, many innocent victims have fallen in that region. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs have been in contact with allies, with stakeholders in the region. We are there to play a leadership role and a collaborative role in order to help resolve this conflict. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Before Thanksgiving, the Minister of Industry said prices for groceries are coming down. Canadians just needed to check out grocery flyers. But now the Prime Minister, or the Minister, is backtracking, saying, well, he's not sure because the grocery CEO's plans are too secret. If the Minister can't get answers, then we will. Will the Minister of Grocery Flyers support our motion to summon the grocery CEOs back to Parliament again?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question, Mr. Speaker. I'm really surprised in the way of that question, Mr. Speaker. We did one thing that has never been done in Canadian history. We called the 5 CEOs of the groceries in Ottawa, Mr. Speaker, and we expressed the frustration of 40 million Canadians, Mr. Speaker, about the price of grocery. I would enjoy all members of this House to give the same message that I give. Make sure you help Canadians and help us to stabilize price in Canada. That's what Canadian expects.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Clearly, the Minister's plan to ask them nicely is not working.
That's right.
On va résumer. Un jour.
Let's summarize. One day, the Minister says that they need to check prices in flyers. But now they don't know CEO's plans to stabilize prices because their plans are too secret. It's very clear that the Minister doesn't have a plan, so we can give him one. We tabled a new motion to force CEOs of large grocery chains to come back to appear before committee. Will the government support it? Yes or no? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear the question from the Leader of the NDP. Not only is that what we proposed, but I wrote to the chair of the committee to ask the chair to invite the CEOs of large grocery chains in Canada to share their plan with Canadians. So I'm glad to hear his question because we are the ones who asked the chair of the Parliamentary Committee to ask the CEOs to come and appear before Canadians.
The
Honourable Member for Thornhill.
The government is saying that they have not been briefed on verified intelligence confirmed by the President of the United States that has led to the retraction of media reports around the world about yesterday's explosion by IRGC-backed terrorists that killed innocent civilians in Gaza. After 8 years, is the relationship with our closest allies, our Five Eyes partners, so damaged that they don't even share with Canada what they have already told the rest of the world?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The situation in Gaza is a tragedy. The loss of Palestinian lives is absolutely horrifying. This is an unthinkable act, and it's imperative that innocent Palestinians be protected and that international law be upheld. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Calgary Forest Lawn.
The Business Council of Canada is warning the Liberal NDP government they can no longer run large permanent deficits without fear. After 8 long years, this Prime Minister added more debt than every government between 1867 and 2015 combined, creating 40-year highs in inflation and the fastest interest rate hikes ever. There is a massive fear of a looming mortgage default crisis if they don't balance the budget now. He's just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister stand up today and support our common sense, fiscally responsible motion to bring in balanced budgets so Canadians can keep their homes?
Nanahab Secretary.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague talks about fear. There is also fear among Canadians that the Conservatives are going to cut programs that they rely on. Mr. Speaker, this week, the Canada Child Benefit checks will arrive at Canadians' doors, Mr. Speaker. And in the members' riding in Calgary Forest Lawn, that means that individuals will get up to $10,000 lowered from their child care fees. Mr. Speaker, there are also 400,000 families in Calgary Forest Lawn that get the Canada Child Benefit checks.
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
The Prime Minister promised that interest rates were going to remain low, and Canadians believed him, so they went out, they bought homes, and they took out mortgages. But after 8 years of liberal inflationary deficits, interest rates are at a 30-year high, and many Canadian families are now not finding they can't pay their mortgage. In fact, the Business Council of Canada just said governments can't permanently run deficits without fear. So will this finance minister stop running her inflationary deficits so interest rates will come down and Canadian families won't lose their homes?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, and of course, allow me to correct the record. There are actually 400,000 families in Alberta collecting the Canada Child Benefit checks, Mr. Speaker. Those checks are coming out this week. And Mr. Speaker, under what the Conservatives are proposing, they would have those checks completely removed. They would be cutting those supports for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I will remind you that while we continue to support Canadians, we are also running the lowest deficit here in Canada among all G7 countries. Good job.
Député de Dufferin-Caledon.
Mr. Speaker, there's only one cut that we're going to make. We're going to cut about 80 members from that side of the House when we form a common-sense Conservative government. And when we do that, we will address the concerns like the ship worker in Vancouver who's paying $7,500 a month for a mortgage. Wow. And what do they say? They talk about a AAA credit rating. How out of touch. They're gaslighting Canadians. Will they cut these inflationary deficits and get interest rates under control? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to hear the member of the opposition speak about C-SPAN. It is a very important member of the business community in my riding of North Vancouver. I was very pleased a couple of years ago to join the Prime Minister to announce the commitment to build an additional 18 Coast Guard vessels worth almost $16 billion, which will provide well-paid employment for the employees at C-SPAN for decades to come. Mr. Speaker, we are going to create good economic jobs, we are going to ensure economic opportunities for Canadians, and we are going to ensure affordability at the same time.
Hear, hear. I'm going to ask once again for members to please refrain from taking the floor when they are not been recognized by the chair, and to leave the questions so that they can be answered so that colleagues can hear them.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. In the coming months, we expect to see a wave of mortgage renewals. RBC is going to renew 41% of its mortgages, but it's going to be difficult with interest rates that keep rising. We're seeing inflation on mortgage costs reaching over 30% a month. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, nothing's going right. Will he explain to people how they're going to pay their mortgages and not end up in the street? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Statistics Canada gave us good news. Inflation went down again here in Canada. Our government continues to work to help Canadians that are having trouble making ends meet. In this House, we have a bill before parliamentarians that will stabilize grocery prices throughout Canada. The Conservatives are playing political games with measures that could help Canadians. The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. I'm not sure where she read that good news, because we heard from Statistics Canada that inflation went up in Quebec and hit 4.8%. That's the fourth month in a row that Quebec has had the highest inflation rate in Canada. Food inflation's at 6.7%. After 8 years under this Prime Minister with his help from the Bloc, people are literally having trouble feeding their families. Are these the sunny ways promised 8 years ago? This Liberal government's not worth the cost. Does the Prime Minister recognize that in Canada in 2023 it's shameful for people to struggle to feed themselves? The Honourable Minister.
Allô, je suis là, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
I'm here, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to affordability, we need to help all Canadians, and that's exactly what we're doing on this side of the House. This morning, we've heard a statement that 98% of housing starts are due to programs that will help Canadians get a roof, and we're going to continue to work on that. The Honourable Member for Davignon, Lamitis, Matane-Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, S&P Global revealed that Canada is going to be one of the world's leading oil producers by 2024. Forget the green transition. Canada is going to be one of the biggest oil producers on the planet. The Conservatives applaud this, but it's not their doing. It's the Liberals doing. Under their watch, oil production went up by 10% in the midst of a climate crisis. Under their watch, Canada will produce 500,000 more barrels of oil every day. Is that really the environmental record Liberals want to leave as their legacy?
I'd like to ask before the minister answers the question, I'd like to ask the member from Signal Hill to please wait his turn to be recognized by the chair to take the floor. The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable colleague sait que le cause de changement.
My honourable colleagues know that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to reduce those emissions in every sector of the economy. We have a detailed plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to grow an economy that will be prosperous, in an economy that will be low in carbon. And that's what we're going to continue to do. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Canada is going to become a worldwide driver for oil production 2024 thanks to Trans Mountain. Trans Mountain is going to enable Canada to break oil production records and therefore break pollution records. But taxpayers are paying for Trans Mountain, and it's costing us $30.9 billion. $30.9 billion is almost $800 a person, including babies. The Liberals are charging us $800 each to pollute more. Not to mention subsidies and the costs of natural disasters. How dare the Liberals ask Quebecers to pay to pollute more? The Honourable Minister. I thank my colleague for her question, but I'm wondering why she's not talking about what the government has done recently. We recently announced the biggest investment in the history of Quebec called Northvolt. That's going to make batteries for electric vehicles. My colleague should have focused on that issue, because not only will Quebec be a champion of the car industry, it's going to be a champion of the green economy. That's what we're doing.
Député de Peterborough-Kawartha.
Over and over, this Liberal NDP government promised interest rates would not go up. But after 8 miserable years of this Prime Minister, Canadians know that is not true. Mortgage defaults and forced home sales are on the rise. Lindsay is one of hundreds who wrote to me to tell me about her skyrocketing mortgage rate. She's paying an extra $1,250 a month. She doesn't have an extra $1,250 a month. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. So when will he stop his inflationary spending so Canadians like Lindsay can keep their home?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, last week I had the opportunity to visit Peterborough, that member's riding, where I announced $42 million for the construction or renovation of over 1,100 units of housing. You know what's interesting, Mr. Speaker? Wow. That member voted against every program that made that funding possible, Mr. Speaker, and then she tried to take credit for it. It's astounding what the Conservatives continue to do. What Canadians need is a government to be behind them, to see more construction built, to see the Canada Child Benefit continue to have an effect. Dental care, child care, they're against all of those, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Calgary-Mindeford.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, the deficit continues to rise. In March, the finance minister said that this year the deficit was going to be $40 billion. Well, the parliamentary budget officer just told us that she was off by at least $6 billion. Wow. Earlier this month in a Senate committee, finance officials couldn't even say what the Liberal NDP government is spending on debt interest charges. This Prime Minister simply isn't worth the cost. So when will this Prime Minister come up with a plan to balance the budget so Canadians can keep their homes?
L'honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, I find it highly shocking that Albertans from the Conservative Party in this House are absolutely silent on a matter that really affects the middle class in Alberta. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about the government of Alberta trying to take Alberta pensioners out of the Canadian pension plan, destabilizing the pension plan for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. They talk a big game in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, but when it comes to actually defending Albertans, they sit on the sidelines while we have their backs.
The honourable member from Mégantic-Lérable. After years of inflationary spending, the Prime Minister has literally killed the dream of young Quebecers to become homeowners. Imagine a young Montrealer has to earn $116,000 a year in order to buy a house, which doesn't include a 20% down payment. How can a young person earn that kind of salary and put money aside for that? After 8 years, do the Liberals realize that the Prime Minister is not worth the cost and that people in the middle class can no longer afford a Prime Minister that's mortgaging their future? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What Montrealers don't understand is why Conservatives are delaying the implementation of measures that will help build more apartments, more homes throughout the country. We have a bill before this House, and the Conservatives, even those who said publicly they'd vote for it, well, they don't want it to move forward. We're being slowed down. And we can't deliver because the Conservatives are delaying a bill in this House, and it's shameful. The honourable member for Mégantic-Lérable. The Liberals should have called so that we could discuss it. They're the ones who are delaying passage of this bill after 8 years of the consequences of Liberal action are disastrous. In Quebec, inflation is the highest in the country, nearly 5% for the 4th month in a row. Like all parents in Quebec, I'm worried for my children's future. They're going to be facing the highest interest rates in the last 40 years. Food is too expensive, rent is unaffordable, and interest rates are skyrocketing. When will they stop mortgaging the future of our children?
The
Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the Conservatives love to claim that they can give us lessons in economics, but the last time they were in power, not only did they leave behind a mess for Liberals to clean up, they cut in pensions, they cut in EI, they cut in border security, the army, federal prisons in science and research. Here, we support economic growth, but the Conservatives are only good for axing. They're not so good at calculating.
L'honorable député de Vancouver-Est.
The City of Toronto and housing advocates warn that unhoused people will die as the weather gets colder. Toronto's shelter system, the largest in Canada, is beyond capacity. Hundreds of people being turned away every day, including refugees and asylum seekers. Successive Liberal and Conservative governments walked away from housing and left the city scrambling to house people in need. Toronto is pleading for support. Will the Liberals step up and provide the funding required to the City of Toronto so that no one has to sleep or die on the streets this winter?
Hear, hear. L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, I've worked with that member for a number of years now, and I don't doubt for a moment her commitment to housing. And she knows, because she voted for it, that we doubled the funding for homelessness through the Reaching Home initiative. And in fact, Toronto's received $290 million to combat homelessness. We will continue to work with not-for-profit organizations that are on the ground doing the vital work to get people off the street and providing them with the wraparound supports that they need to make a transition towards something better.
Here.
Good job.
L'honorable député de Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, homelessness in Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, and Port Moody is up by 86%. Community leaders from the Tri-Cities Homeless and Housing Task Group are calling for political courage. I agree. People unable to find a home is past the point of a crisis, and with colder weather on its way, action is needed. But the Liberals are out of touch, and their lack of concern is appalling. What are the Liberals going to do to get people into affordable homes before the winter?
L'honorable député, l'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
This government was the first government in Canadian history, in fact, to recognize that there is a human right to housing. And we continue to act in that vein through the National Housing Strategy, a strategy that has resulted in 70,000 people being taken off the street, 122,000 people who were very close to being homeless, no longer in that position because of the vital supports that they've been given. They are now housed. We'll continue to do everything we can, and we embrace partnership through working with provinces, municipalities, and I emphasize not-for-profit organizations that are key to all of this.
Good job. L'honorable député de Kings Hants.
Speaker, our government is focused on helping Atlantic Canada drive the tremendous economic opportunities that exist for clean energy in our region. That's exactly why we advanced Bill C-49 in close partnership with Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. We also have a mutual goal of getting off coal-fired electricity while expanding clean energy grids. Premier Higgs and Houston were both in Ottawa this week to talk about their provincial plans to do just that. Can the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources explain how our government is working in cooperation with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to support that crucial transition while being mindful of affordability? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable ministre.
Thank you to the member for his continuous advocacy for Atlantic Canadians. He and his Atlantic Liberal colleagues stood up against the Conservatives who opposed Bill C-49, including Conservative members from Atlantic Canada, whose communities will benefit from the good, sustainable jobs and economic opportunities that this act will bring. This week, Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick agreed to advance collaboration and progress on delivering clean, affordable, and reliable electricity while phasing out coal by 2030, driving to net zero electricity grid by 2035. This will fight climate change and create good jobs and economic opportunity across Atlantic Canada.
L'honorable député de Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the State Department updated their travel advisory to Lebanon to the highest level, advising all U.S. citizens of the following: do not travel to Lebanon. But the government's overall travel advisory for Lebanon advises Canadian citizens to avoid non-essential travel, which is not the highest level. Why is this government always a dollar short and a day late when it comes to protecting the safety and security of Canadians overseas?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would disagree with the honourable member. We are never late protecting Canadians We will always stand up for the security and safety of Canadians here in Canada and abroad. As the Speaker knows, yesterday the Minister indicated that Canadians in Lebanon should make plans to leave. We are aware that the situation could be volatile there, so we want to make sure Canadians are safe. So she has advised Canadians to leave the area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Then I have député de Wellington, Halton Hills.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government has been late. It was late in the fall of Kabul in August of 2021. Has the government not learned the lessons of 2006 and 2021 of Beirut and Kabul? Throughout the Middle East and North Africa, there has been an outbreak of protests and violence targeting Western interests and Western missions. Will the government clearly communicate to Canadians information necessary to ensure their safety and inform Canadians about security threats they are facing in the region in a timely manner?
Le secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, Mr. Speaker, we have, and we will continue to. These decisions are made by officials on the best advice. We will continue. We will continue, as we always do, to ensure that Canadians are safe when they are abroad. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, 8 years of inflationary Liberal policies have forced Quebecers deeper into debt. We learned today that Quebec is Canada's inflation champion for the 4th month in a row. Groceries, housing, gas, everything's more expensive, courtesy of the Liberals with Bloc support. And the experts don't see any change anytime soon. Can this government finally offer Quebecers some concrete solutions and quit their reckless spending and get rid of the carbon tax?
Then I have
the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always surprised that there are Conservatives from Quebec talking about the carbon tax because, Mr. Speaker, there is no carbon tax, no federal carbon tax in Quebec. Quebec is a leader when it comes to action against climate change. Mr. Speaker, we don't want to backtrack under the Conservatives. We don't want to stop our action to protect our environment in Quebec. The Conservatives are completely out of touch. The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, 8 years of inflationary Liberal policies have forced Quebecers deeper into debt. Young people are afraid they'll never be able to own a home. Others are suffering from financial anxiety. In spite of this, the government and the Bloc are supporting an increase to the carbon tax. We can't say it often enough. A vote for the Bloc will cost you. Why doesn't the Prime Minister give Quebecers a break and backtrack on his inflationary carbon tax?
The
Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, my colleague talks about cutting, but where? In housing? Is there too much money going to housing? Is it pensions? Does she think our seniors are getting too much money? Is it dental care? Is it child care? Perhaps culture? Because they're so happy to make cuts in those areas. Which would they choose? They should stand up and say where they're going to make the cuts. The honourable member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals committed a terrible injustice when they created 2 classes of seniors by refusing to increase the OAS for 65 to 74-year-olds. Today, they have a historic opportunity to fix it. They can treat all seniors fairly in the face of a soaring cost of living and economic uncertainty. Will they support the Bloc's bill, C319, and put an end to 2 classes of seniors by increasing pensions for everyone 65 and over? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've made huge progress in helping seniors out. This has helped reduce poverty among those 65 and over. We restored the retirement age to 65. We increased the GIS, despite the constant opposition from the Bloc. And yes, we increased the OAS for the most vulnerable seniors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, that's not right. If seniors were satisfied with the federal government, groups that represent them like the AREQ, the AQRP, and the AFES wouldn't be on the Hill today. They're here to ask the government to support C319. Seniors are the ones telling us that C319 will make a difference in their lives. They're the ones saying that only a fair pension increase for all seniors will protect them from financial insecurity. That's what seniors want from the Liberals. Will they finally listen and support the bill? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we restored the retirement age. We brought it back down from 67 to 65. We increased the GIS. And we did this in spite of the Bloc's opposition. We increased the OAS for those seniors that are the most vulnerable and for those with in need of dental care and other care. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Deputy Abbotsford.
Today, this House will vote on whether to protect the mentally ill against assisted suicide. But yesterday, the Justice Minister falsely claimed that euthanizing vulnerable Canadians was good public policy and the only way to comply with Canadian law. Meanwhile, we're hearing more and more reports of Canadians crying out for help and being offered assisted suicide instead. Is this the sorry state of our mental health system? Millions of Canadians oppose this government's fascination with assisted death. Will this government now bring a full stop to this madness?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, there is not one among us in this House that doesn't have people that we love that are deeply vulnerable, that have been in a state of mental health crisis. And every single person in this House wants to make sure that those people get the support and strength they need. That's why we're making critical investments there. But we also have to make sure that people who are trapped in mental illness and deep, profound suffering, that we examine what's the best way to deal with those circumstances. That's why we're working to reconstitute the Joint Committee so that we can look at this process, look at how we responsibly deal with these issues in a way that respects and protects vulnerable people.
Each year on November 11th, we gather to remember those who have made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of our nation. But now, under this Liberal government, our military chaplains are being told they can't even pray for the fallen. During World War II, chaplains led prayer on the boats on the eve of the D-Day landings. And chaplains have provided last rites to dying soldiers in the fields. But now, the Prime Minister is telling Canadians that on Remembrance Day, they can't even pray for those who fought for our country? What is going on, Mr. Speaker?
Here, here.
Over there. Shameful. That's hideous.
Stephen. L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, écoutez, aujourd'hui.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give a shout out to our veterans and all those who've served our country. Everyone, to all these people, we need to say thank you. Thank you to the men and women who, particularly at this point in time, are defending what we do. And November 11th, as it is for many of my friends and colleagues here, on November 11th, we will remember and we will never forget everything our veterans have done for us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Wow. Shameful. Wow. Shameful answer. Wow. Unacceptable.
L'honorable député de Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are discriminating against people of faith who are wanting to pay tribute to our veterans. And it's bad Liberal policy that is actually driving down morale in the Canadian Armed Forces. It was reported that troops are leaving the forces in droves because of the lack of good, affordable housing. And sadly, military families are being forced to ask for donations to help offset the high cost of food and housing. After 8 long years, the troops can no longer afford these Liberals or will make that sacrifice. When will the Prime Minister finally start supporting our troops? Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, I won't take any lessons today from this side of the House. Because you know what, Mr. President? When they were in power, they actually cut spending, fall below 1%. Let me be very clear. Military members and their families are our top priorities. And we're taking steps to ensure that they are supported. In our budget 2022, we've invested $55 million in residential housing for CAF. We will be there for our troops. We will always support them, Mr. Speaker.
Colleagues, because the parliamentary secretary was close to me, I was able to hear her answer. I'm not certain if other members were able to hear her as clearly. Colleagues, I do ask you to please cede the floor to the person who's been recognized by the chair to be able to answer the question so that you can answer it. You can ask again. The honourable member from Madawaska, Restigouche.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. En tant que
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the Acadian community in New Brunswick and the proud member for Madawaska, Restigouche, I'm pleased to repeat the announcement that was made a short while ago about the Acadian National Celebration for 2024. My colleagues and I, Acadians, want to ensure that these celebrations continue to enjoy support from the federal government. Can the Minister of Canadian Heritage explain how the federal government is supporting the Acadian community, its culture, and its celebrations?
The
Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I have to say that my colleagues worked very hard on the announcement that was made today, and I thank them for their cooperation. The announcement today reasserts the federal government's commitment to Acadian culture and history. And with the announcement today, we are going to be providing the $500,000 that is needed. So the we're rounding up to with a $250,000 commitment, and this is great news. And it is added to the funding for the Acadian Convention that is soon to come.
Député de Brantford-Brant.
Mr. Speaker, no one is above the law. This includes the Prime Minister. And after 8 years, he is the only one in Canadian history found guilty of breaking not one, but 2 ethics laws. And now with the RISE scam, the RCMP is investigating criminality in the highest echelons of this government. And what is the Prime Minister's response? He shuts down debate. He shuts down committee, and now he hides behind cabinet confidence. He is not worth the cost. Under dark clouds of suspicion, will the Prime Minister cooperate now with several RCMP investigations?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member opposite should know by this time, the Prime Minister does not dictate committees. In fact, it is the responsibility of members in this House to determine what the committees decide to move forward with. But with that being said, Mr. Speaker, we have faith and trust in the RCMP and those that are set to investigate any accusations of wrongdoing. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to any reports that come forward from the RCMP, and Mr. Speaker, any form of misconduct will have consequences.
May I remind the member from Brantford Brant to please, he had the opportunity to ask his question, to please listen to the response without comment. The honourable member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Well, Speaker, Canadians would love for reports to come from the RCMP, but this Prime Minister is hiding behind cabinet confidences in the NDP Liberal coalition to keep Canadians in the dark about wrongdoing. That's why they weren't able to launch that criminal investigation into this government. And if you can believe it, there's a $1 billion so-called green slush fund that, through misappropriation and conflicts of interest, this government has had to suspend because there's $150 million taxpayer dollars that have been mismanaged. Now whistleblowers are looking for employment and reprisal protection, but we know that this government will do what they always do and throw a whistleblower under the bus, just like they did with Jody Wilson-Raybould when she called out corrupt Liberals. Will they protect these whistleblowers?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question, and for Canadians watching at home, remember to this House what are the facts. The moment, Mr. Speaker, that we heard about the allegation of misconduct, we immediately commissioned a third-party independent expert to investigate these allegations. They reported back to me, and Mr. Speaker, we have suspended, in good governance, the funds that would be disbursed to protect the interest of Canadians, and I can assure this member that we'll take all measures required to make sure that proper governance is applied in all agencies of the Government of Canada.
It's not true, though. PSPC knew in advance.
de Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court has declared the Liberal No More Pipelines Act unconstitutional. Ignoring concerns from Canadians, the Prime Minister and his Minister for Carbon Taxes seemed hell-bent on destroying our natural resource sector. After 8 years of this Prime Minister's anti-resource agenda, Canadians are suffering. Common-sense Conservatives will advocate for our natural resource sector. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Mr. Speaker, when will this NDP Liberal government do the right thing and repeal this disastrous bill?
Hear, hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, I think Canadians understand that when the Conservative Party was in power, they gutted the environmental legislation that existed in this country in 2012. They undermined the confidence that Canadians had that the environment was going to be protected, that the rights of Indigenous peoples would be respected, such that good projects could go ahead. We have put into place a system of better rules that ensure environmental sustainability, respect for Indigenous rights, that will accelerate the work that we are doing to ensure that good projects move ahead. With respect to the Supreme Court decision, there are some surgical tweaks that we will make to ensure that we actually move forward.
The honourable member from Winnipeg South Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Jews in Canada represent just 1% of the population. Yet, as Irwin Collar reminds us, they are victims of 67% of reported hate crimes in Canada. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, and Mr. Speaker, Islamophobia is too. I met with Jewish students yesterday who are afraid to be outed as Jews in their own community for fear of their safety. I have spoken with Muslims who are afraid to be outed as Muslims in their own communities for fear of their safety. Can the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion let us know what role the government is playing in addressing the real anxieties of Jews and Muslims in Canada right now? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I first want to acknowledge just how difficult the past few days and weeks have been, both for the Jewish and Muslim communities, and I want them to know that all of us here stand with and in solidarity with the communities. On Monday, Mr. Speaker, we announced the appointment of Ms. Deborah Lyons as Canada's Special Envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. And as she stated, Mr. Speaker, she will work closely with her counterpart, the Special Envoy on combating Islamophobia, to support both communities policies during this difficult time when feelings of anxiety, tensions, and fear are on the rise, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, diversity is at the core of who we are as Canadians. We all need to be united in standing up against hate and intolerance whenever, wherever.
L'honorable député de North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, those who join the Canadian Forces do so because they believe in service to their country. Now members are leaving their jobs because they can't keep up with rising house costs. Those who keep us safe can't afford a home. And the Liberals and Conservatives solution? Leave housing to condo developers who keep costs so high. The people who serve us deserve better. What is this government going to do to ensure that members of the Canadian Armed Forces do not become homeless?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, I want to say thanks to the member for raising, and I know how advocate she has brought forward a lot of issues in this House. But let me be very clear. Military members and their families are our top priorities, and we're taking steps to ensure that they are supported. This is why we're working with our stakeholders to align resources and acquire additional housing, Mr. Speaker. In our budget 2022-2023 alone, we've invested $55 million in residential housing for our CAF member. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable député de Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The incredible irony here is that the portions of the impact assessment law the Supreme Court found were in excess of federal jurisdiction were the sections created by Stephen Harper in wrecking our previous predictable, strong environmental assessment legislation, the so-called designated project list, which was a very bad idea, the expert environmental law panel created under former Minister McKenna and then ignored by the government in bringing forward C-69, has the answers the government needs. Will this minister commit to reviewing those recommendations and putting them in place?
L'honorable ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we can agree that the Conservative Party destroyed environmental legislation in this country, undermined the integrity of those processes, such that it was incumbent on the new government to actually bring into place better rules that would allow major projects to be built in this country, that respected environmental rights, that respected the rights of Indigenous peoples. We have delivered that. We certainly respect the decision of the court. We will be making amendments to the Act, but the Supreme Court was clear, let me be very clear about this, that Parliament can enact legislation to protect the environment, and we certainly will continue to do that.
This brings to the end of oral questions. Colleagues, I wish to draw the attention of members to the presence of the gallery.